Well, my very earliest memories that I can recall is being a child, perhaps about 2.5, and I found myself in a tea chest box which was made of plywood. Of course, the lid was off, but and was in the small shop that Abba had rented from an agent who charged £1 a week, which was roughly $2 in today's money, and that included the condemned premises, which was situated about 50 yards at the rear of the premises and on a 2-story level. The shop was about 8 feet wide and about 15 feet deep, and my early memory was being in this box. It was like a playpen, if you like, so that my mum could help with the assistance in the shop at the time. It was a retail drapery store, and it was called David's Drapery Store. The reason it was called David's because when my Abba, who lived originally in Bendair, but came to Israel in the year in Palestine at that time, in 1917, to escape from the pogroms that were occurring and the looming revolution that was impending at the time. The reason it was called David's was because when H.J. Ginges, who was Dad's first cousin and had lived in Newcastle, he was visiting Palestine at the time and offered to have one of his cousins, if they wished to, come to Australia, because at that time times were very difficult in Palestine. People were going hungry. There were Arab riots, and the offer was made to Abba's brother David. But Abba's brother thought it would be a better idea if my Abba came, because Abba had procured a home for the family, being the older child of the family, and his brother David thought it'd be a good idea if Abba would come to Australia. That would then perhaps he would become the inheritor of the home that Abba built for his family, for the mother and for his family.
Who built the home? Abba? Oh, okay.
Yeah, my Abba. And so when so Abba discussed with my mum what should he do, because at that time Seema had been born, and she thought it would be a good idea for him to take up the offer and go and try and make a living in Australia. So when he eventually arrived, he had worked for H.J. Chaim Joseph Ginges in Newcastle as a signwriter, because Dad was that was his profession in Palestine. He earned a living in that manner, and he worked at H.J. Ginges's home business in Hunter Street, Newcastle, which was a 3-story clothing department store. Anyway, eventually he left there and saved sufficient money by going hawking himself, and eventually finished up in Narrabri, and he was able to bring my mum out 6 months after he had started to work. Originally, he made his headquarters at Muswellbrook, and that's where I was born. And after I was about a year old, Dad decided to move to Narrabri, and he rented this premises in Maitland Street, Narrabri. It was only a small shop, but as I said, my early memories were that Mum was serving behind the counter. I found myself in this tea chest, which acted as a playpen, and years later, when I started my business, people asked me, where did you get your experience? And I used to answer them, well, strictly speaking, I was born in the business. My other memories were that Mum used to cook on a Primus stove, a little Primus, which worked with kerosene and methylated spirits. My early memory was that she used to cook at Simmers on this little stove for Abba to come from the bigger shop that he'd just recently rented, about 6 doors up from where this store was. It was a much larger store. It had premises above, and we eventually moved from the small shop to the larger shop. There was just Seema and myself and Mum and Dad. I remember when I was 3 years of age that Dad had called me from the footpath in the street. I must have been about 20 yards from where he held up a tricycle, and with joy and excitement I ran to get this tricycle so that I could ride on it, and that was my 3rd birthday. When I was a child, I used to wander up the street. People were quite friendly, the shopkeepers, and I remember one particular shopkeeper who had a tyre repair business, and during the winter, Seema and I would sit in the pit of this shop where tyres were being retreaded, and Mr. Oliver was a very kind man, and he used to allow us to sit there, and we'd get warm with the donkey that was the machine that kept the heat of the equipment to retread tyres. Afternoons, Seema and I would go to the matinee picture theatre, and we became friendly with the people at the hotel next door called the Clubhouse Hotel, where they had a pianola, and we used to play on the pianola with delight because there was a family. The Nixons had a family of children that were similar ages to ourselves, and at this time we must have been around about 9 or 10. The biggest shock to the family was when our mum passed away. I remember when I was about 7, we went to visit her at the hospital just opposite the railway, at the local hospital in Narrabri, and Mum's forehead was burning with fever, and I remember putting my hands on the steel bedhead and then laying my my cooled hand on her forehead, which was absolutely burning. When we came out of that visit, Abba had talked to the doctor, and the doctor just shook his head and informed him that it looked as if there was no hope for her to survive. And then a few days later, Abba informed us that Mum had passed away, and and Seymour and I were in the kitchen, and he very sadly told us the situation. I believe Mum was Mum was taken to be buried at Newcastle, Sandringham, the Jewish section of the Sandringham, Newcastle cemetery. We only learned about this later, and of course, sadly, we went to school as we did normally, and Dad was really at a loss to know what to do with us. It was very difficult for a man without his wife to look after children. So he arranged with Mrs. Calcott, who had a fish and chip shop, and she made toffee apples as well. And even though she was a Catholic woman, she paid for her to help look after us until he sorted out how he was going to cope with the situation. Mrs. Calcott, not knowing, what Mrs. Calcott did, one evening she, as we went, we had our baths, and she had us kneel on the floor to say our prayers. Well, Seymour and I looked at each other. I was 7, Seymour was 9. We knew that was wrong, and we immediately went to Abba and explained what Mrs. Calcott did. Well, I think Abba almost lost his temper, but he came in to inform her it wasn't right for her to do that, and she must cease from doing that in future. And of course, because we were always brought up very Jewish, when I first went to kindergarten, I used to go on Friday afternoons or Fridays with Seymour, just to be introduced to what school would be like when I turned 5. The minute I walked into that school, I knew one thing. I was different to all these kids. When we sat on the school mat in the kindergarten, I knew that I was different to all of these children. I was Jewish and they were not Jewish, and there was definitely a distinction. I must say that Abba was very happy to make Kiddush and to keep up Jewish traditions in the country, even though we were one Jewish family almost for living in isolation for almost 20 years. But when I was 3 years of age, 3.5 perhaps, Abba used to put me on his knee in the evening, and he would get me to read Hebrew at that age. And of course, I was quite tired. It was 7:30, 8 o'clock in the evening, and with my eyes half closed, I would read Olafar Izar and so on until I could read a sentence in Hebrew, which made Abba very pleased. When I turned 4, and he used to pay me a penny for every line that I read. A penny was a lot of money in those days. You could buy a very large ice cream and a cone for a penny. But when I turned 4, he got me to read and continued to want to pay me a penny, and I said no. I said I want 3pence. So that was my first trading deal that I ever did at a very early age. Okay. Yeah. One of Mum's dying wishes that was explained to me years later was that she said to Abba, you know, that he will get a lot of nachas from Seymour and me, and her wish was that we both should be taught music. She felt very strongly about that, and in her hospital bed she asked Abba that would be a request she would like for him to have us learn music. The only place that you could learn music in those days was the convent, and at 8 years of age or thereabouts, I started to learn the violin, and Seema started to learn the piano. And later in life, as we got a little older, we used to play in the Narrabri town hall, which was a fine old established town hall, and play at concerts for the school and other talent quest functions that were held. We, as a matter of fact, I did the violin as a subject, and music as a subject for the intermediate and leaving certificate, and got was quite accomplished in that with that music. I used to go to violin lessons at the convent around 7:30 in the morning. I used to protest a little that I didn't really want to go, but Abba was a very determined man, and he almost slapped me by the ears to the lessons, to make sure that I had the lessons, because in his mind he wanted to fulfill the dying wish of my mum. I didn't know that at the time, but that was, I think, the thing that drove him. When I was around about 12 years of age, I came out of the convent on my way to the school, and I had the violin tucked under my arm, and my school case in the other arm, in my other hand, because the school was, our school, public school, was situated about a block away from the convent school. And coming out of the gate on my way to the school, a little boy, Johnny McNamara, who was about the same age as me, said to me, "Hey Maxie, put 'em up." "Put 'em up? What do you mean?" He made a gesture as if he wanted to fight or hit me, and I said, "What's the problem?" He said, "You killed Jesus." I said, "I killed Jesus? I didn't even know him," I told him. So at a very early age, I was either facetious, either cynical, but whatever it was, that's the way I expressed myself. And that was one of the incidents. I had very, very few incidences of anti-Semitism, although I remember coming home from school one afternoon around the corner from the post office, and outside a billiard saloon where the local taxi rank wasn't a large taxi rank, one taxi for the whole town, or two. They called me over, a group of men standing there. This would have been around 1940. And laughingly, they said, "Hey, Maxie, if you say Hail Hitler 3 times, we'll give you threepence." Well, I didn't know, really. I was a child of 9 or 10. What did I know? All I knew is they were offering me threepence for something, and threepence was a heck of a lot of money. It was a long time since I'd seen threepence. But I said, "Well, if I say it 6 times, would you give me 6pence?" And so I got 6pence. I said it quickly 6 times, and I got 6pence and ran off. But that would have been a very rare incident of, if you could call it, anti-Semitism. They didn't really know. We were one Jewish family. Abba was a very hard-working man and very highly respected. During the war years, he helped gather, pack papers in boxes for the war effort, and whatever was needed to help dig trenches around the school, because around in 1941 there was a threat of the Japanese invading Australia, and Dad was always forthcoming in volunteering for any effort that was needed in the town. Opposite the store that we had, which was then called Max Ginges Bargain Drapery Store, was a large food store, like a grocery store. They sold hardware as well. And Dad once called me over to the front of our shop and he asked me, "Berel, what do you want to do when you grow up?" And I said to him, "I'd like to work at Fox's, this big department store." And the reason I'd like to work there was that they had an orderliness about them. All the soups were in one place, the jams were in another. And in those days, it wasn't self-service. A customer would walk in, go to the counter, wait for an assistant to serve, and the merchandise would come from the shelves, and the man would write out a docket by which had a indelible, like it had a carbon paper, and he would write out the docket, add it up, and send the docket in a little box, either pneumatic or by strings with wire, to go to the office upstairs, and you'd wait for your change, and then you'd take your groceries and go home. And the idea of the orderliness of that sort of business compared to what our business was like was very appealing to me. So I really had a feel for wanting to work in a store rather than be a professional or a lawyer, because I was brought up in that atmosphere and it appealed to me. During the school holidays, we used to come home from school, both Seema and I, and when the store was busy, we'd help in the shop. Particularly on Saturday mornings, we'd help, and then farmers would come in from the different district to buy their wares. Sometimes we used to sell merchandise at the rear of the store after hours, because the farmers had come a long way and they knew we lived at the rear of the premises, and so we had very good sales from those farmers who would come after hours or on a Sunday sometimes to shop. Even though the shop wasn't open, Dad would open the shop. On one occasion, I remember a man came in at the store and he really reeked. I don't think he'd had a wash for a long time, but it was my job to serve on the men's side of the counter. And even though we had an assistant there, I used to be forthright in wanting to serve, to show what I could do. Anyway, one day a man came in and he sat down and he said, "Could I have a pair of socks?" And I said, "Yes, what would you like?" The ones with the elastic top, which is 1 3/4, equivalent to 15 cents today, or these non-elastic top. The elastic top was the one that would hold the socks up, but the ones without the elastic top might tend to roll down, and the non-elastic were 10p halfpenny. Anyway, he chose to have the 10p halfpenny one, and then consequently he took off his shoes. I was very impressed. He took off his shoes and he took off his perfectly good socks, but he had such dirty feet that the socks that he was wearing must have itched him. And so what he wanted to do was to wear a pair of clean socks, and he threw the dirty socks over the counter and proceeded to put on these fresh clean socks, and he said, "That's wonderful." I later asked Dad, it was quite surprising to me that a man wouldn't wash his feet and then he wouldn't have to buy a pair of socks. He said, "Well, if He said to me, if people did that, we wouldn't be able to make a living. He said, this way we can make a living if their feet itch. He said, there are 5 clothing stores in this town. The population of the town is 2,500 people. In the district there's 4,000. And this would have been about 1938, 39. And I was very impressed with that story. On another occasion, a man came in one Saturday morning and from the country, and he wanted a pair of boots. He wanted a pair of boots size 8. I said, certainly, and I went down behind the counter, below the counter, a little bit further away from where the man was sitting. He sat on the chair in the store, on the men's side of the counter. And so I proceeded to look. I asked him, would he like a pair of brown boots or black boots? He said, it doesn't matter. So I looked through the brown boots, and I see size 6, I see size 7, I see size 9, I see size 10. No 8s. Then I proceeded to the black box. Size 6, size 7, size 9, size 10. No 8s. So knowing that it would be wrong to allow the man just to tell him we haven't got them and then he would proceed to another shop, I said to Dad, who was standing behind the cash register, which was located in the middle of the store, only a few feet away from where I was, I called him over and I said to him in Yiddish, Dad, this is no size 8. He says, plenty 8, plenty. So I thought to myself, okay. I never said anything, but I thought to myself, I've been through this box twice. I was very careful. And I couldn't see one pair of 8s. But if my smart dad wanted to find 8s, good luck to him. So Dad used to have behind his ear an indelible pencil. An indelible pencil is that one that if you lick it, then and you write with it, it's very difficult to rub it out. But he had this, I don't know for what purpose, but later I could see there was a purpose for it. So when Dad remarked there were plenty of 8s, he could see that perhaps I may have been right. There weren't any that were marked 8, but he said to me to ask the customer if he'd like a small 8 or a large 8. And I asked the man, would he like a small 8 or a large 8? And I suggested to him that he take a large 8 because I noticed what Dad had done. He took the indelible pencil, licked it, and from the 7 he carved an 8, and from the 9 he carved an 8. So when I suggested to the man he'd be better off to accept a large 8, he said, that'll be fine. I said, but maybe, and I provided him with some tissue paper to push in the toes of the size 9, which became a large 8, and he took 2 pair. So that was one of my lessons in not allowing a customer to escape from the shop, but do your best to try and provide him the best service you can.
Yeah.
During the war, there was a big shortage in elastic and rubber and all sorts of commodities. People used to have coupons to buy certain merchandise, although there was never any shortage of foodstuffs in the town. But elastic was in very short supply, and Abba had the foresight in early 1939. He went to the bank across the road, the Bank of New South Wales, and asked if he could borrow money. He wanted to stock up because he could smell that war was coming. The bank manager thought this was not a good idea, and he didn't really help Abba all that much because we didn't have much collateral. But Abba was so sure that this was going to happen, we had upstairs 5 bedrooms, 2 of which, or 3 of which eventually got converted into storerooms. Seema and I used to have 1 bedroom together when we were younger, but then eventually we were separated and had a bedroom each. So that left 2 storerooms for Abba to fill with stock, and he consequently bought up a lot of towels, sheeting, elastic, because he felt that if the war would come, there would be a shortage of cotton, there would be a shortage of rubber, which would be needed for tyres, for army vehicles and so on. And it all turned out well, because when the war was declared, all of a sudden there was a big shortage in rubber, a big shortage in cotton, and we had towels that lasted, the quantity of which lasted almost the length of the war years. And what Abba used to do is, if someone would come in to buy a yard of elastic to replace their so that their pants wouldn't fall down, they would insert the elastic in their pants. In those days, people were very thrifty. They didn't earn a lot, and so they used to patch trousers, they used to darn socks to reuse them, they used to insert elastic in perished rubber that was around their waist. And what Abba used to do was to say, well, if you want a yard of elastic, you spend £10 in the shop, I'll sell you a yard of elastic. That was his way of dealing, and it worked out very well. And I think that's enabled him eventually to save sufficient monies when we eventually sold the shop. And as we grew up and didn't want to live in Narrabri anymore, because Seema was already 18, I was 17, and we wanted to live amongst Jewish people finally. On one occasion, I remember a woman who was a very large woman, and when she almost needed 2 chairs to sit on, she was so large. She reminded Seema and I, because she had of an Orpington chook, she had a very large chin, almost rolling, and she came in and she asked could she have a double XOS pair of pants. Well, I think Abba used to have, in those days, sizes went from extra SSW, SSW, which was small women's, SWW, XW, OS, XOS, double XOS, triple XOS, and quadruple XOS. He took one look at the woman and he thought that double XOS wouldn't be large enough, and so he got a box of these quadruple XOS pants. And on the counter we used to have a measure which was 1 yard long. So Abba, and in those days the size of a single bed sheet would have been 54 inches. So Abba took hold of the pants and measured them across the seat for this woman who wanted to buy a pair of pants for herself, and he measured them 36, and then he took a little bit more. It was 54. He said, oh, these should fit. It's the size of a single bed sheet. When I was at school, I was quite active in many facets of school life, but one of the things that I remember very clearly was I must have been about 9 or 10, and in those days the school was a certain size, but they did build sort of little buildings in the middle of the schoolyard to accommodate the extra children that were forthcoming, and they had to accommodate them. And we had a co-educational school, and I really enjoyed going to school. I used to go very early to school on those days that I wasn't having violin lessons. And on one occasion, and the co-educational school, boys and girls, and there was a girl in the class whose name was Berel, but Berel with a Y. My name is Berel with an E, B-E-R-E-L. Her name is B-E-R-Y-L. And we were both quite good at spelling. They used to have spelling bees where the class would stand up, and those who made a mistake had to sit down. On one occasion, Berel Curry and Berel Ginges were the only two standing. So when she said, "Would you sit down, Berel?" we both would sit down. If she would say, "Stand up, Berel," we both would stand up, because we didn't know which Berel she was talking to. And on one occasion, it must have frustrated this teacher, and she said to me, just at the playtime break, would I mind staying back? She wanted to have a chat with me. She said, "Berel, you know, I've been thinking about your name, and you know, I thought it might be an idea, perhaps you might think about it, if you would change your name to Bill or Bernard or Bob or Barry. Berel's not really a name for a boy." And at a very young age of 9 or 10, I looked the teacher in the eye and I said to her, "Teacher, I'll never change my name." And she said, "Why not?" And I answered her, "Because whoever hears that name will never forget it." I thought that was a very forthright answer from a child of that age, and but it was the way I felt about things, and I was very sure that my answer would have been a correct one. It wouldn't even occur to me that I should ever change my name. Okay. At the house that we lived behind the store, the larger store, I could never understand why Abba never ever put piping or hot water or water directly into the kitchen. It wouldn't have cost all that much, and I couldn't understand, but perhaps he was busy with the business and didn't apply his mind to things like that. We had these were the days before sewerage, and the soil man used to come twice a week to cart away the tins of soil from the toilet. He would park the car, the truck, and go from door to door, lifting these heavy pans and replacing them from the toilet and replacing them with another. And he'd hoist it on his shoulder, which might have had a leather cover. And on one occasion, I remember it must have been about 7 o'clock in the morning, I decided that I'd go for a run with him in the pan truck. Anyway, he obliged. He didn't mind, and we went around the block, and he went in and carted the pans. Anyway, when I got back home, I came into the kitchen to have breakfast. The smell must have been atrocious, and I was immediately put into a bath and scrubbed, because it was just it must have been that I smelt like a sewer. Anyway, I never ventured into that sort of experience again. Once was enough. I used to, at school, can you imagine a boy with a name like Berel, Jewish, and a violin tucked under his arm. Coming home from school one day, I was a target for child frolics, if you like. There were the non-Jewish boys who were, I would call the ruffians of the town, would say, "Come on, Maxie, put them up, we're going to have a fight." And they'd form a ring, and I said, "Well, hang on a second, let me put the violin over in the grass," because it was very precious and I didn't want to, I couldn't understand why I couldn't run away, although I would have liked to have. It was only a block from where I lived, but I don't think I could run that fast with a violin and a suitcase and a violin case. Anyway, I found myself in the ring of boys who wanted to bash me up for no reason, just for fun. Anyway, there was a young boy in my class who might have been a class above me. His name was Billy Grayson. And unfortunately, he's since passed away, and we remained friends all these years. But Billy was a very good athlete. He was a very good scholar. He was an all-rounder, and one thing he loved more than anything else was to fight. So, and he was quite good with his fisticuffs. At around 12 or 13 years of age, he was very accomplished in that field of sport. And when he saw the crowd and me in the ring with this tall ruffian, he came over, he said, "Maxie, just step aside, this one's mine," and proceeded to take my place. Well, he was my guardian angel. I was just saved from a fate worse than death. And Billy proceeded to, within 2 seconds, the guy was I think his name was Ned Petrie, and he was on the floor, on the grass in 2 seconds flat. And then Billy would say, "Is there anybody else like to fight Maxie?" So he was my saving guardian. When I was around about 10 years of age, I was always involved in school plays and that, because I had a feeling for that particular type of art. And whenever there was a school play done by the high school, I was invariably asked to participate. One day a teacher came to me and said, "I want you to go over to the high school," and I proceeded over to I didn't know for what purpose, but I went over to either first year or second year high school. I would have been in 5th class, and I had to teach the children there how to scream, which was a very unusual, but they felt that I could show them how to do it, because I must have been reasonably self-confident to be able to stand in front of a class and to act in that way. On another occasion, when I was in high school, from the very beginning, they used to have what they called a speech contest day, and speech contests were held on the 24th of May, which celebrated the founding of the British Empire, or it was of the founding, but it was certainly British Empire Day to celebrate, and it was a half a day holiday at school. But in the morning, it was decided to have speech contests, public speech contests. Well, I entered from first year high school, and not knowing really how to compose a speech, I asked Abba if he could help me compose a speech. And one of the speeches that one of the topics that we had to speak on one year was what is the future of aviation in Australia. Another one was what is the future of Australia. And each year, from the time I was 13 until the leaving certificate, I won every year, except on one occasion. I think I might have been in fourth year high school. One of the teachers, Mrs. Reek, who used to teach us French, and her husband used to teach us mathematics, said to me, look, it's not fair that each year you go in, you don't give the other children a chance to win the contest. And so she talked me into not contesting in that particular year. I should never have done that, but she appealed to me to allow another child to win it. Because they felt that I would win it again. It just seemed unfair to them. I couldn't see later on in life, I couldn't see why they would do that, but nevertheless I complied. But one of the speeches, what I used to do when I was 13 or 14, in one of the speeches that Abba wrote out in Yiddish, and because he used to speak to us in Yiddish, I used to answer him in Yiddish. So it wasn't difficult for me to translate into English a speech that he wrote in Yiddish. And the speech was on the future of Australia. And having seen different speakers like Churchill speak on, well, we didn't have television, but on the newsreel that used to be played before the main, used to have newsreels before the main feature, and speakers would invariably take a glass of water, and I thought that's a good trick. So what I did was I had the glass of water on the dais, and these speech contests were held in the local town hall, and the whole school went across to, and people from the town would come to listen to the different speakers' contest. When it was my turn to contest, I said to my schoolmates, when I pick up the glass, you start clapping and cheering, you see. So I preempted so that the judges would feel that my speech must have been good because the kids were extremely impressed. So I said a couple of sentences, and then I picked up the glass of water, and of course cheering broke out and yelling broke out, and I put the glass down. Then I said another couple of sentences, and then I picked up the glass again, and more cheering broke out and more clapping broke out. So whether the speech was good or not, all I know is that I won, because the judges, I felt, must have been impressed with the clapping and cheering of my schoolmates. And of course, once one started to clap, the whole audience started to clap. They thought I'd finished, but I hadn't finished. I just was speaking intermittently. But that speech I remember very, very clearly, and the way Abba had understood from Australia in those years, Australia had a population around 7 million people, and he saw great danger in Australia being such an isolated country, surrounded, well, even though we were part of the British Empire, Britain had let Australia down when the Japanese were threatening. Hence the fall of Singapore put panic into the hearts of Australians because we were really under threat. Britain said they were too busy on the European front and they couldn't come to our aid. The only country that we could rely upon, according to Abba, would be America. So in my speech of that year, I finished up the speech by saying the only future that Australia, the only hope that Australia would have for the future would be to become a state of the United States of America, because that's the way Abba saw the only protection we could get from a very populous country and a very strong country was America. But that didn't eventuate. Abba also said when I was around that age, around 10 or 11, he spoke to me once about that Australia was surrounded by hundreds of millions of people, like Indonesia had a couple of 100 million, Malaysia had a vast population, India, China, and we were really quite an isolated country, and he felt that in years to come, perhaps in another 50 years, there would be a very large Asian influence in Australia. Even though his prediction, and it's now the year 2001, his prediction of Australia becoming a state of the United States didn't eventuate, and nor did Australia get overrun by Asians, although I must say that there is a very big Asian influence in the population of Australia since his time.